statement and by matching the entries on the bank statement to the entries that are in bank services. So it automates the reconciliation process for you. And the second main feature is for those entries that have not been entered in bank services as yet, that appear on the bank statement that has been imported, you can generate those entries directly off the bank statement to bank services, accounts receivable, and accounts payable in Sage 300 ERP. So not only does it automate the reconciliation, but if there's any of you that are sitting there from your bank statement and you're entering transactions in bank services or accounts receivable or accounts payable from your bank statement, that entire process becomes automated with RecXpress. Because the bank statement's already imported, we then allow you to generate those entries off the bank statement, and so saving you time of having to enter those entries in Sage 300 ERP. That being said, let's now go through the functionality. Let me show you how we achieve that objective of automating the reconciliation and also auto-generating the entries from your bank statement to Sage 300 ERP. Now, the first function we have is RecXpress bank formats, and in the RecXpress bank formats, you can see a list of all the bank formats that are supported by RecXpress. And if you select your North and South American region, you can see all the bank formats that are currently supported by RecXpress. We also have a RecXpress transaction codes, and the transaction codes for each of those bank formats that have been developed and are supported by RecXpress. Each of those bank formats have a transaction code list. And to have the transaction code list makes not only the bank reconciliation, but also the generating of entries far more powerful in the RecXpress product, because all the transaction codes that are submitted to Perisoft at the point that we develop the bank format are added to the transaction code list for that format. And the more transaction codes there are on the list for that particular bank format, the more entries on the bank statement can be identified when we use those entries to generate from the bank statement through to Sage 300 ERP. Now, in the bank transaction code list, all the transaction codes that were submitted to Perisoft at the time that the bank statement was developed would be added to this list. But you can go in here. If you have transaction codes coming through on your bank statement when you import it on a monthly, weekly, or daily basis, and you see additional transaction codes on your bank statement that is not on the list, you can then come, select your bank format, and hit the insert key and add your own transaction code and give it a description and assign it to one of the default categories in RecXpress. The benefit of doing that is the next time that that particular transaction code, and you can see my transaction code list is a numeric transaction code list, the next time that transaction code 1000 comes in on the bank statement, it will be identified as bank charges and belonging to the bank charges default category. Now, when you add the transaction codes list here, you can add it to any of the default categories supported by RecXpress, but you can also set up your own categories and move your transaction codes and group them in these categories. And that is what I'll be showing you next. So let's just close our transaction code list, and let's go to where we actually set up our transaction codes list and group them into categories. Now you can see we have a default code here, and before I launch into the actual functionality of the default code, let's just give you a bit of a background on what we're trying to achieve with the default code. The default code is a template where you would set up the rules of those entries that are on the bank statement that you now want to generate from the bank statement through to Sage 300 ERP Bank Service Accounts Receivable Accounts Payable. You will set up a rules template to, first of all, identify the entries on the bank statement, and then once the entries on the bank statement has been identified, what rules should apply to that entry so that the information that that entry requires to be generated to Sage 300 ERP is allocated to that entry once it has been identified. I can still see a question here coming on the chat, so I might as well deal with it quickly. For use of RecXpress, do you need Cashbook? No, you do not need Cashbook. I was only referring to the Cashbook product and the RecXpress product to show you that we had that RecXpress for Cashbook product for quite some time. You do not need the Cashbook to use RecXpress. The RecXpress I'm showing you today, you only need Sage 300 ERP because it actually does the reconciliation and the generation of the entries for you to Sage 300 ERP bank services, accounts receivable, and accounts payable. So you certainly do not need the Cashbook product. If you do run the Cashbook product, you would then run the Cashbook RecXpress product and not the RecXpress for bank services. Good. So let's continue with our defaults here. So the first thing we need to do with our default rules template is we need to set up our categories. And here you can select the new icon and you can set up your own categories. So you can set up as many categories as you please, and you can group your transactions according to these categories. And remember, the main reason for setting up our rules template is first of all to identify the entries on the bank statement, and then to provide the rules of how those entries will then be generated through to Sage 300 ERP. For each of the categories as well, we can set up an auto-sequencing number. So at the top of your category, you can select the auto-numbering tick box. You can add your own prefix and your own next number. Now, why would you want to do an auto-numbering sequence that you set up? A good example would be bank charges. When your bank charges come through on your bank statement and you import your bank statement, the reference number for those bank charges on your bank statement is usually a very long numeric number that makes no sense to you as the client that's downloading the bank statement. It is purely a number that's generated by the bank system that the bank uses. Now, if we use that reference number for bank charges to generate the bank charges entries through to bank services, and then post bank services entries through to general ledger, then in your bank charges account in general ledger, you are going to be sitting with all those long numeric references that actually have no meaning to you, that only mean something to the bank system. So here we give you the opportunity to select whether you want to create your own auto-numbering sequences. And these auto-numbering sequences will then be assigned to the entries, like bank charges or whatever other entries you are using the auto-numbering sequences for, so that the auto-numbering sequence will then replace the reference number that's on the bank statement, and it will use the auto-numbering sequences reference number when the entries are generated through to bank services. And then when the entries end up in your bank charges account in general ledger, you will have your own auto-numbering sequence that makes sense to you, that runs in a sequence that you've selected with a prefix that you have selected. So you can set up the auto-numbering sequence for the entire category. And then on the actual transaction code line, you can also select whether you want for that particular transaction code that belongs to the category, if you want to auto-number that transaction code, because you will find that you might have many transaction codes that are grouped in one category, and for some you might want to use your own auto-numbering sequence, and for others you want to use the reference number on the bank statement to be generated through to bank services. So if on the line itself, under auto-number, you select no, it will then still use the reference on the bank statement, and it will not use an auto-numbering sequence. If you select yes for the auto-numbering field on the transaction code line, and you enter your own prefix and your own next sequence number, it will then use the prefix and sequence number that you enter on that particular transaction code line to do the auto-numbering sequence for that particular transaction code. And if you select auto-number yes, and you leave your prefix and your next sequence number blank on the line, it will then use the prefix and the next number that has been assigned to the category. So you can see it's very flexible. You can either not use the auto-numbering sequence for a transaction code, even if you've selected it for the category. You can use an auto-numbering sequence that belongs particularly to that transaction code within the category, or you can use the auto-numbering sequences on the category level for all the transaction codes that belong to that category. Now, first of all, let's see how we're going to be identifying the entries on the bank statement. Because before we can apply a rule to the entry on the bank statement, we need to identify the entry. And the primary identification mode for the entries is by transaction code. So here in the transaction code field, you can see you can go and insert another line, and through your transaction code finder, you can select any of the transaction codes that's applicable to your bank statement format. And of course, remember, you can also add your own transaction codes to that bank statement format. Now, once the entry has been identified by the transaction code, that might be sufficient. Let's use bank charges as an example again. You might only want to identify all your bank charges entries only by the transaction code, because all the entries with that particular transaction code will be generated to one bank charges account in the general ledger. And if you are happy with only using the transaction code to identify the entry, then in your compare method here, you can select none. And then only the transaction code will be used to identify the entry. And once the entry is identified by that transaction code, it will apply the rule that is set up on this transaction code line. But in many cases, you are going to find that the transaction code is not enough to identify the entry on the bank statement by. And that is when you can then come into the compare method, and we have two compare methods that you can select to use not only the transaction code, but also the description coming through on the bank statement to identify the entry on the bank statement. Now, if the description on the bank statement entry is exactly the same every time you import your bank statement, then you can use the compare method equal, and in the next field, your compare description field, you can then enter the value that that compared description would be equal to on your bank statement. And because the description is exactly the same, you can then use equal, put the exact value in compare description, and when that particular transaction code number is identified with that description, it will apply the rule on that transaction code line to that entry on the bank statement. But in many cases, your description will not remain static. It would not be exactly the same every time you import your bank statement. In many cases, there might be text that remains the same, but there might be numeric value like a date or something that's also included in the description that changes on a monthly basis. And if a part of the description on the bank statement remains the same, but not the exact description every time, then you can use the like compare method. And the like compare method is like the contain statement. It means that if you use the like, the value you enter in your compare description field, it will take that string of characters and it will look for that string of characters within the description on the bank statement for that particular transaction code. And if it finds that string of characters anywhere within the description, it will apply the rule on that transaction code line to the entry on the bank statement. So you can see you can either use only transaction code to identify or transaction code and description. And in addition to the transaction code and the description, you can also enter the statement amount for those entries that might have the same amount that comes through on the bank statement every time you import the bank statement. If you leave the bank statement amount field as a zero amount, it will not consider the bank statement amount. But if there is an amount in the bank statement amount, it will then take the transaction code, see for that particular transaction code if we are using the description to identify the transaction code as well. It will then take the description identification into account and the amount. So it will identify the entry using 3 criteria: transaction code, description, and amount. So you can see we've gone to great lengths to give you very powerful functionality to make sure that you can identify as many entries as possible on your bank statement to apply rules to and to automate that generation feature so that you can generate the entries directly from your bank statement to Sage 300 ERP. Now, once the entry has been identified by transaction code, description, and amount, you can then enter the rule that applies to that particular entry. So let's go through and see what rule we will apply to that particular entry on the bank statement when it's generated through to bank services. The first field is the entry description field. And in the entry description field, if you do not want to use the description that is imported for that entry on the bank statement to be used as the description when that entry is generated through to Sage 300, you can then enter your own entry description in this description field here. And if you have a value, that value in the entry description field will then become the entry description instead of the bank statement entry description when that entry is generated through to Sage 300. The distribution code. The distribution code that you set up in bank services, you can select in your rules line so that that distribution code is used to distribute the entry to the general ledger account, etc., that has been set up for that distribution code in bank services. And of course, in bank services, if you set up the distribution code to go to one general ledger account, that is all good and well. But if you want to take the bank statement entry and you want to disperse the bank statement entry across multiple general ledger accounts, then you can also set up a distribution set on the rules line by selecting the distribution sets that you've set up in bank services to distribute that bank statement entry to multiple general ledger accounts in that distribution set that's been set up. Also, all the tax fields, the comments field, etc. are there. So if the entry is a taxable entry, all the tax group, tax class, whether the tax is inclusive, etc. fields are there to be set up so that the tax is calculated according to the tax rates you set up in tax services, and the tax is separated to the tax account, and the tax tracking report is updated with the tax portion of the entry if tax is applicable to that particular entry. And then we also have a entry type, and in the entry type you will specify whether this particular entry on the bank statement is going to be a straightforward bank services entry that will be generated through to bank services, an accounts payable entry, or an accounts receivable entry. Because when the batches are generated from the bank statement, it will generate batches to accounts payable payments, accounts receivable receipts, and of course your bank services bank entries. Now, if you've selected your entry type as accounts payable or accounts receivable, then you need to specify which vendor or customer code in accounts receivable or accounts payable applies to that particular rule for that entry, so that when it's an AR or AP entry, the rule will then provide the information of which vendor or customer account should be allocated against in accounts receivable and accounts payable. And once you've provided the vendor or customer account, you can then also select how the entry should be allocated against for that vendor and customer account. In the auto allocate field, if you select no prepay, a prepayment entry will automatically be generated to the customer or vendor account when the entry is generated to the accounts receipt or accounts payable payment batch, and you can then go through the apply document mode and select that prepayment entry and allocate it to the invoices through the apply document mode. If you select yes to auto allocate, the allocation will then take the bank statement entry amount and it will start allocating from the oldest outstanding invoice in that customer or vendor account until the amount of the bank statement entry has been completely depleted. Now, if there is still a remaining amount on the bank statement entry, in other words, the bank statement entry amount exceeds the outstanding balance of the vendor or customer account, then a prepayment entry will be generated of the whole bank statement entry, and then once you have generated those invoices, you can then go through the apply document mode once again and allocate it against those invoices. So yes to auto allocate works on a balance forward system where it will allocate from the oldest outstanding invoice until the amount on the bank statement is depleted. We've also got an equal amount option that can be selected for the allocation. The equal amount option will take the bank statement entry amount, and when it allocates against the customer or vendor account, it will find the first outstanding invoice that is equal to the bank statement entry amount, and it will allocate it against that particular invoice in the customer or vendor account. And finally, we also have a document number option. Now, if you have any of your customers paying you through internet banking and they are using the invoice number that they are paying you as a description that they're sending through to your bank statement, then you can use the document number option. And if that option is selected, it will look for that bank statement entry in the description field for the invoice number. It will find the invoice number and it will search through the customer or vendor account, and the first invoice it finds with the same number, it will allocate against that invoice. We also support optional fields, so you can select optional fields for both your accounts receivable receipt and your accounts payable payment batches. And then we also have a category maintenance tab. And the category maintenance tab we have given you because we know that you are going to be evolving and creating your own categories. And you will see when you start working with the product, the more time you actually take to set up your categories and to set up rules and to identify more and more entries on your bank statement that are recurring entries that are coming through every time you import your bank statement, the less time you are going to spend entering these entries. Because once you set up the rule, you will never have to enter that entry again. The rule will automatically generate the entry. And the only time you then have to go and change anything regarding that entry is if the rule for that entry has changed or if it's a new entry that you're setting up a rule for. So you can see how much time it can save you sitting there entering recurring entries every time you bring in your bank statement. Now in the category maintenance, you would then select your category from one of your categories that have already been set up. And in our case here, I'm just going to select deposits, which is one of our categories. And you can then select one of your own defined categories that you've set up. For instance, AR. And once I select my AR category, I can then select any of the transaction codes that I have set up for the deposit with the rule and move it seamlessly from my one category to my other category. The whole point of the category maintenance is that once you've added a transaction code and its rule, we don't want you to ever have to go and add that transaction code and rule again just because you want to make it belong to a different category or another category you've just added. So this gives you the power to seamlessly move a transaction code and a rule that you've set up between categories from one category to another without having to re-add that rule in a category that you might have just created. Good. So now we've set up our template with our rules, and now we are ready to go ahead and import our bank statement. And that we do by going to our RecXpress transactions. And in our RecXpress transactions, we have the first field here is our bank code. And that is the bank code that you set up in bank services that you are going to be importing the bank statement for. We also have a reconciliation description, and the reconciliation description is completely up to you what you want to put in there. We can just put for our purpose here, bank reconciliation for November 2020. The template field allows you, through the Browse button, the first time that you import a bank statement for this particular bank code, to select a location on your network with a template file name to save all the information on this import form to that template file, so that the next time that you come in and you select the bank code for this particular bank, it will automatically retrieve your template file, which will now be saved for that bank code, with all the options that you selected on this form already completed and populated to the various fields that have been saved to the template file. And that will just save you the time from having to come and select the same options in this form every time. You can save it to the template. If there's any changes made to the template, once you close the form, it will ask you if you want to update the template permanently, and those changes will be saved to the template. Then we select our default code, and the default code is our rules template that we've just set up with all our rules now that applies to this particular bank format. And of course, once we've selected the rules template, it will also know what the format name is. Now, for our demo purposes today, our format name is a custom format because I'm going to be importing a custom bank statement format that I've set up in Excel. But in practice, the format name will have your bank format name for your bank statement that you've downloaded from your bank. The other options we have here is we've got a clear existing recon data option, and you can see mine is disabled because it's the first time I'm importing a bank statement. But if you've previously imported a bank statement, you can select the clear existing recon data option, which will clear out your previous bank statement that you've imported into RecXpress before the next bank statement is imported. So if you select clear existing recon data, it clears out the previous bank statement has been imported for this bank code before it imports the next bank statement. We also have a clear button here at the bottom that you can use to clear out the bank statement for that particular bank code. The only difference between the clear button and the clear existing recon data is the clear existing recon data works in conjunction with the import. It clears out before the import is done. And of course, the clear button you can select at any point without having to import the bank statement to clear out the previous bank statement that's been imported for that bank code. Match amounts option, you can check the match amounts checkbox if you want to also, when the automatic reconciliation is taking place from your bank statement to your entries in bank services, to match by amounts. Let me explain a bit more in detail the match amounts option, because it's a very powerful reconciliation option. The first reconciliation matching that takes place when the bank statement is imported is done by reference number. So it takes the reference number of the bank statement entry and it looks for that same reference number in bank services. If it finds that reference number for entry in bank services, it will match those two entries against each other and reconcile them against each other. Now that match by reference number works very well for payments, because you would have a check number that you would have entered in your bank services entries, and that same check number will be on your bank statement when your bank statement is imported. But when it comes to deposits, the deposit reference that you enter when you enter the entry in bank services is not going to be the same deposit reference that is coming through on your bank statement. And that is where you would then use the match amounts option to match those entries that were not successfully matched by reference number from the entry on the bank statement to the entry in bank services. You can then match those remaining entries that were not matched by reference number by amount, and it will then take the amount of the entry on the bank statement, and it will look for the same amount of an entry in bank services and do a second matching process for you by amount. And by doing the matching of the reconciliation by reference and amount, you get a very accurate and very complete automatic bank reconciliation process. We also have the standard bank services fields that you would be used to in bank services displayed on this form. And then we have a RecXpress section. And the RecXpress section will have your last statement date, which you will see will be updated as soon as we import our bank statement. the last statement balance. It has the imported total, and you can see my totals are all 0. Once we've imported the bank statement, you will see these are updated. The imported total is the net total of all the bank statement entries that have been imported through the bank statement. The matched net total is a net total of all the entries on the bank statement that were successfully matched to entries in bank services. Then our unmatched total are those entries, it's the total net amount of all the entries on the bank statement that were not successfully matched to entries in bank services. We also have a matched with error net total, and the matched with error net total are for those entries where the reference number on the bank statement was matched to a reference number in bank services, but the amount of the entry on the bank statement differed from the amount of the entry in bank services. Now the variance amount between those two entries, this would be the net total of all the variance amount entries for those entries that have been matched with error. Good. Now that we've gone through the totals and that, you will see here in our script file path name, you can then select your browse button, and you can select the location on your network where you've downloaded your bank statement file to, so that RecXpress knows to pick up the file from that location with the file name to import the bank statement. Now once you set up your location, you can obviously save your location to your template file, and as long as you then download your bank statement to that same location on your network every time, the template file will populate this field automatically with the location, and all you have to do is change your file name at the end. For our purposes today, because I'm bringing in my own custom Excel bank statement, I'm going to leave that field blank, and I'm going to hit import, and I'm going to select my own Excel bank statement file to import. Once I then select to import the bank statement, it will tell me exactly how many bank statement entries has been imported, and at this point it has imported those 50 that it's indicated their bank statement entries for me into RecXpress, and it has applied the rules template that we've set up to those entries on the bank statement. So it's identified the entries on the bank statement according to our rules template and applied the rules to the entries. If I close this dialog box, it then goes through and does the matching, the reconciliation process, first by reference number and then by amount. And you can see now we have now updated all our totals here with the imported, matched, unmatched, and matched with error totals. And our RecXpress button has become enabled, and we can proceed to our RecXpress reconciliation. Now all the entries you see in your RecXpress reconciliation are the entries that have now been imported via the bank statement. And each of the entries would have been assigned an import status according to the matching process that had taken place by reference number and amount from the entries on the bank statement to the entries in bank services. You can also select the Show Bank tick box to show a second grid at the bottom of your display to show the bank services entries. So the top section would be your bank statement entries that have been imported, and the bottom section would be your bank services entries. And as you scroll through the top section, it will call up the bank services entry that it was successfully matched to in the bottom bank transactions grid. Now you can also select to display your bank entries by your own sort sequence. You can select to display it by the reference number on the bank statement, by the date of the entry on the bank statement, to sort by the amount of the entry on the bank statement, or by the bank services reference. That would be, if the entry was matched successfully to an entry on the bank services, the bank services reference that it was matched to. Many bank formats also support a statement number that is imported. So you can sort by that statement number. You can also sort by transaction codes, which is very useful if you want to group all your transaction codes together because when you group your transaction codes together, those are typically transaction codes you want together, so you can apply similar rules to those transaction codes or group those transaction codes to one category in your rules template. Or you can sort by the GL account. That would be the GL account that has been assigned to the bank statement entries according to the rules template that has been applied to the bank statement entries. And then finally, also, you can sort by the categories that you set up in your rules template. Once you've selected your sort sequence, you can then also select your sort order, whether to display ascending or descending. And you can select to display only a particular category in your rules template. So if I wanted to show only my adjustments category, only my accounts payable, accounts receivable, only my bank charges entries, or only my check entries, I can then specify the category and display only the entries that belong to that particular rules category. Of course, if I clear my category there, I can just hit the Go button at the top again, and it will display all my categories again. Similarly, with your bank services entries in your bottom grid, you can sort your bank services transaction display by reference, by date, by amount, or by description, and select the sort order either ascending or descending. You can also check a tick box to show only the entries in bank services with an outstanding status to be displayed in the grid. Or if you want to also show entries with a cleared status, you would then untick the only outstanding tick box, and it will display cleared and outstanding entries in the bank services section. Just to show you as well, all the rules as you can see, have already been applied to the entries. But you can evolve your rules template from here, because we realize that when you bring in your bank statement, it should be from here that you want to evolve your rules template. So any rules you set up here or changes you make, for instance, if I had to change this from checks to bank charges, as soon as I tab off there, it will ask me, I have changed the category for that particular reference. Do you want this change to also affect your default template? If I then answer yes there, it will then automatically change that rule and move it from the check category to the bank charges category for me. Okay, so for our purposes, I'm just going to change it back here. You can see then that you can then evolve your rules from your reconciliation. Now, I'd like to go through all the import statuses that have been assigned to the entries when that matching process took place. At the moment, I'm showing all my entries, but if I go to the correctly matched display mode, in the correctly matched display mode, all the entries of the exact match import status will be displayed. And in this display mode, you will have complete peace of mind that the correct entry on the bank statement was matched to the correct entry in bank services. Why do I say that? Because the reference number of the entry on the bank statement is identical to the reference number of the entry in bank services, and the amount of the entry on the bank statement is also identical to the amount of the entry in bank services. And as you can see, if I scroll through the top section here, it calls up the entry in the bank transaction section in bank services that has been reconciled against that entry. In our matched with error display mode, those are those entries where the reference number on the bank statement was matched to the reference number in bank services, but the amount of the bank statement was different to the amount of the entry in bank services. And those entries are then given a reconciled in error status, and it displays the variance amount of the difference between the bank statement entry amount and the bank services entry amount. And in this matched with error display mode, you can see at the bottom of the form here, we have a batch generation feature where you can generate a batch with these variance amounts to create write-off entries in bank services automatically of those variance amounts. And we will come back and do that before we complete our reconciliation. Our next display mode is matched amount. And in the matched amount display mode, it will display those entries which were not successfully matched by reference number from the bank statement to bank services, but because we selected the match amounts option, the matching amount process then matched the entry amount on the bank statement entry to the entry amount in bank services. And you can see the bank statement entry amount is the same as the bank services entry amount. And once again, in this display mode, you will have peace of mind that the correct entry on the bank statement was matched to correct entry in bank services, because only one entry in bank services were found to have the same amount as the entry on the bank statement. So if you scroll through those entries, you will see only one entry is called up in the bank services transactions grid. Our next display mode is more than one amount. And the more than one amount will display those entries that when they were not successfully matched by reference number, but they were matched by amount, the amount on the bank statement entry, there were more than one entry that was found in bank services to match that entry amount. And once again, 99.9% of the time, the correct entry would have been selected by RecXpress to match against. And the reason I say that is because once the amount is matched and it's found that there is more than one amount in bank services that matches the entry, it then takes the entry date into consideration. And it will reconcile the bank statement entry to the entry of the same amount in bank services that has the closest date to the bank statement entry date. And of course, it will then show you in the bank services transaction section all the bank services entries with the same amount. And you can still fine-tune your reconciliation. If you're not happy with the transaction that RecXpress is selected, you can just click here in the used column to change it from yes to no, and then reconcile it against another transaction in your bank statement import section. Then we're going to look at the no match display entries. And the no match display entries are all those entries that could not be matched either by reference number or by amount from the bank statement to entries in bank services. And these are typically the entries that we want to automatically generate from RecXpress through to Sage 300 ERP with the rules template that we've set up. As you can see in the no match, it will then display all the entries in bank services for me that has not been successfully matched against in bank services. And you can then do some of the entries a manual reconciliation by selecting the top entry and matching it against a bank services entry if you wish. Now, just to recap, RecXpress has done the automatic reconciliation as far as possible for us by reference number and by amount, and if there's more than one amount found, by the date as well. Now all that remains for us to do is, if we have a scenario where there are more than one bank services entry that needs to be matched against a bank statement entry, to match those entries. And of course the other way around as well, where we might have more than one bank statement entry that needs to be reconciled against a bank services entry. And I'm just going to take you through that and show you how we've provided that functionality. This particular bank statement entry, I am going to reconcile against two bank services entries, and here in the comments field you can see I'm going to reconcile it with the two bank service entries with those two reference numbers. So I select the bank statement entry in my top grid, I then drop down to my bank services entries, and I'm now going to find the entry I want to reconcile it against. And I found my first deposit entry, and I go to my used column and I click my no to yes, and you can see it's now taken this bank services entry amount and reconciled it against that bank statement entry. And at the moment it's matched with error, and I've got a variance amount of 4,500, which is my second bank services entry amount, which I need to reconcile against that bank statement entry. So I then select the second bank services entry, click yes, and there my entry is now perfectly reconciled, the one bank statement entry against the two deposits in bank services. I can do the same here for this particular bank statement entry, just to illustrate the point clearly. And that particular bank statement entry I am now going to reconcile against three deposits in bank services. I select my first deposit, my second deposit, I can still see there's a variance amount until I select my third deposit, and they're perfectly matched, and I've matched those three deposits against that one bank statement entry. We can do the same for our checks, and we have 4 checks here that we can use an example, where we have 4 checks that we are going to be reconciling against one bank statement entry. So I select the bank statement entry once again on the bank statement section. I drop down and I now go to my particular checks that I want to reconcile against that bank statement entry, and I then select my first check by just clicking. My second check, sorry, that's not the right one, so I just unclick it. So I go to 393, select my second check entry, 394, and I can still see that I've got a variance amount, which is my 4th entry. And there I have now my 4 entries reconciled and no variance amount. Once I then refresh my reconciliation, it will remove those entries from the no match display, because those entries are no longer not matched, they are now successfully matched. And I can now see those entries in the many bank to one statement display. And there we see our first deposit entry, and neatly we see our 2 deposit entries in bank services, which was reconciled against that deposit entry. Our second bank statement entry of our 3 deposits in bank services was reconciled against that entry, and then our final bank statement entry of the 4 checks we've reconciled. Now all that remains is to do those entries where we have many bank statement entries that we want to reconcile against one bank services entry. And for that we go to the many statement to one bank display mode. And in the many statement for one bank display mode, I am now going to select many bank statement entries to reconcile against one bank statement entry. I select my first bank statement entry in my bank statement section. I then go down to my bank services entry and I select my first bank services entry to reconcile, and I just click yes, and it now removes my other bank services entries because it knows that I'm going to reconcile many bank statement entries to one bank services entry because I'm in the many statement to one bank display. I can then select my second bank statement entry, and if I then click in the used column again, it adds the second bank statement entry amount to my matched balance here, and I can see my matched balance is still not equal to my bank amount of the bank services entry. I then select my third bank statement entry. It adds it to the balance, and then my final bank statement entry, and there my matched balance is perfectly matched to my amount of my entry in bank services. Now all that remains to be done, we've done our many-to-one and one-to-many matching. RecXpress has done the automatic reconciliation for us. All that remains now is to generate those entries off our bank statement through to Sage 300 ERP with the rules template that we have set up and that RecXpress has applied to our bank statement import. And that we do in the no match display mode. We just select the batch button. It says, do you want to create the batches from the RecXpress unmatched entries? We say yes, and it starts generating the batch for us. Now it does a validation process to make sure all the information that is required is available to generate the entries through to Sage 300 ERP. And if any of the validation fails, as is the case here, a GL account code cannot be blank, it means that a GL account code has not been allocated to an entry that we've selected for batch. And the reason I show you that is because when I close this dialog box, you can see it jumps to that particular entry. You don't have to go and find the entry. RecXpress will jump to that entry, and you can then go for that entry, and you can go and enter the GL account for that particular entry so that the entry can be generated to the batch. So then once you've entered your GL account code for that entry, you can then go ahead and you can then generate the batch again. So we're just going to enter our GL account code here. And of course, in the beginning here, just to show you, you've got an all on button to select all your entries for batch generation, or you can say all off to select none of your entries for batch reconciliation. And by clicking in your select for batch field, you can toggle on or off whether you want the entries to be generated to the batch. Now that we've added our GL account code for our one entry that was missing, we hit the batch button again, and we can select yes to generate the batches. The batches are then generated to accounts payable payments, accounts receivable receipts, and to our bank services. If we now go from our reconciliation here, we don't have to leave RecXpress at all. We now go to our AR batch list by selecting the AR batch list button. We can clearly identify the batches that have been generated by RecXpress in the description, because it clearly states generated by RecXpress. Also, in our source application, the RecXpress source application is placed in the source application field so that you can see that those entries were generated from RecXpress and originated in RecXpress. We can then select these entries to be posted through from the batches, and we're going to post all 3 our batches that were generated by RecXpress in accounts receivable receipt batches. And of course, once those receipt batches are posted through, they are updated to bank services. We're going to do the same for our accounts payable batch that was generated. Once again, clearly in the description and in the source application, we can identify it's from RecXpress, and we now post our accounts payable payment batch through to bank services. Finally, we want to now post our entries that were generated in bank services, and it completely populates the range for us automatically of the entries that were generated in bank services, and we can now post those entries through to bank services. If we look in our no match display mode now, we can see all the entries in our bank statement has now successfully been generated, so they're no longer in the no match, and we don't have any entries in bank services that are not matched successfully again. And all those entries we've generated now, we can now see in the correctly matched display mode with the exact match import status, because obviously they were directly generated off our RecXpress bank statement import, so those entries are now matched to those bank services entries that have been generated through to bank services. Now we only have to deal with that one entry that had the variance amount, and we're now going to create that write-off batch by hitting the batch button again. We are prompted, do you want to create the batches from the RecXpress unmatched entries with the variance amount? And we say yes, and it will now go and create that bank services entry for us, and we can go to the post bank services entries, and for that particular bank services entry, we can now post it through, and it will create that variance write-off for us. Now, where would we find that variance one? In our many bank to one statement, you will see there is the original entry that was reconciled against the bank statement entry, plus our adjustment entry, our variance amount that we've generated. So our write-off entry plus our original entry together make up that bank statement entry. And that is our reconciliation complete. Now that all remains to be done for us is to close our reconciliation, and at this point all the entries are sitting in bank services, but they have not changed their status from uncleared, from outstanding to cleared. It is only when the RecXpress reconciliation is posted through by selecting the post RecXpress that it then updates the reconciliation in bank services, and it changes the entry statuses from outstanding to clear according to the reconciliation done in RecXpress. And you can see clearly here our out of balance. We've still got our out of balance by figure there. And now once we post through our RecXpress, it says, are you sure that you want to update bank services with imported reconciliation? We say yes, and it then posts through the reconciliation, and our out of balance is 0, and our reconciliation is completed. And that, in a nutshell, is how RecXpress not only automates the reconciliation process for you, but also automates the generation of recurring entries coming through on your bank statement, so that you don't have to sit and enter those recurring entries on a continuous basis every time you import your bank statement. Thank you very much for taking the time to join me this morning. That concludes the presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions now. So please feel free to pose any questions.
Okay, Mike, in the question panel there were a couple. There was, can you have an AR receipt be applied to interest documents first and then to open invoices?
The AR receipt through to interest documents first, then it depends, Rob, on basically how those transactions are sitting in your accounts receivable customer account. So if those interest entries are sitting there, they will have obviously their own document numbers. So you can either then select, depending on the way it's going to do is, if you select auto allocate, it's always going to start from the outstanding document with the oldest date. So the oldest date will always be auto allocate. If you select the prepay option, you can then do it through apply document mode. If you select the document number option, then if you've got that same document number of those interest entries sitting on your bank statement, then obviously yes, you can then allocate it through to the interest entries that are sitting in your accounts receivable customer account via the document number, because we'll have the same document number in the customer's account when it's outstanding. Or if it's the same amount and you want to do it by the amount, you can then select the amount and it will find those interest documents to allocate against by amount. So it depends on the situation. If the document number is the same, I would suggest use the document number option, because it will find that interest entry's document number to match the number that's sitting on your description in your bank statement. If the amount's the same, I would do it by amount, and it will find the same interest amount entry sitting in accounts receivable against the interest amount entry on the bank statement. So you have various options depending. Either the amount or the document number, I would say, would be the ones you would use depending on your scenario.
All right, that's great. And Dick, I've just unmuted your line if you had a follow-up question on that to get any clarification that was required. Is that all right? Okay, I guess that is clear. So thanks, Mike. And the next question we had was, when you clear the import, then it will clear and the $0, the RecXpress box, correct. So I'm not sure, Jennifer, if that's, I can open up the line for you if you'd like. And if you want to clarify that question, Jennifer?
Yeah, basically on the screen, you've got the bank statement box, the general ledger box, and the RecXpress box. So when you clear it, does it remove everything in that RecXpress box only?
When you clear it, correct, Jennifer. If you clear your previous bank statement, it will then clear everything in that RecXpress box for you and set you up then for your next bank statement import. You can, of course, if you don't want to clear your previous reconciliation, you can retain that information and you can import your bank statement and then add to the previous reconciliations that you have already imported. But if you want to clear it out, yes, it will clear all your totals, and you will then get new totals when your new bank statement is imported, and it will be the new totals that apply to that current bank statement that has been imported in that RecXpress block.
Okay.
And then Jennifer, you had a second question about when you get an error in the batch, did it process the entries before that error and create a restart batch, or did it not process any of the batch?
That's right. Does my question make sense?
Okay, so you said that if there's any problems with generating the batches in accounts receivable or accounts payable or in the bank services entries, would it then roll back the entire batch process, or would it only not do those particular entries? If there is a problem with that particular entry that is generated through, it will do a validation process before we generate the entries to the batches. And that validation process makes sure that all the validation that is required for that batch to be generated and for that bank services entry to be generated successfully is correct, and that those entries are valid and that those batches will be generated correctly. If they are validated and there is found to be anything like a source code or a GL account code, anything that's needed to generate the batch that could not be validated, the entire process is then stopped and it jumps to that particular entry that you've selected to generate to the batch that failed the validation. It will jump to that particular entry so that you can then enter, and it will give you in the error message exactly why that entry failed the validation, being it a GL account code that you haven't entered, etc., etc. And you can then either select not to generate that entry to the batch, so you can continue with your batch processing, or you can correct that entry and give it the valid information and then continue with your batch processing.
So if you correct the entry, the batch starts over.
Correct.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes. It will not generate some entries and others not. It will stop the process until it can generate all the entries that you've selected for batch to be generated through to the batch.
Okay, is that clear now, Jennifer? Okay. One other question here, Mike. When you say AP batch, do you mean vendors taking out money directly from your bank account? And
when I mean AP batch, yes. I mean that any vendor that you've paid out of your bank account that now appears on your bank statement, that entries on your bank statement can then be generated through to the accounts payable payment batch, so that those entries sitting on the bank statement that has paid those particular vendors can be allocated against those vendors' accounts, so that those payments reflect in the vendor account. So yes, it's any payment on your bank statement that has paid one of your vendors that are set up in accounts payable.
Okay, is that clear, Prabha, or do you need any follow-up question? All right. And I am just listening. In one client's case, the payment is the same each month, but a portion is interest and a portion is principal. This is the leasing company I was talking about. Okay, so Dick, I think I'll open up the line for you as well there.
Yes. What you would do in that scenario is you would use a distribution set in bank services that you set up, and that distribution set will obviously have two distribution codes in it, and the one will be for the one portion of the entry and the other for the remaining portion of the entry, so that when you then use that distribution set in your rules template, it will then take that bank statement entry amount and it will split it according to the two distribution codes in your distribution set that is allocated to that entry. So it will split the entry for you according to the distribution code set up in the distribution set, and that is how you can take one bank statement entry and break it up and allocate it to various general ledger accounts that you might want to disperse it to.
Okay, does that answer your question, Dick? All right, so that's it. That's all the questions that we had in the question window. If you do come up with any others, please feel free to send us an email afterwards. Again, we want to thank you for your time and attention today. We appreciate it very much. And if you do want some additional product information or pricing, please send us an email and we'll follow up with you right away. Thank you to Mike Mills today from Parasoft for being our presenter, and we hope to speak with all of you very soon. Thank you, Mike.
You're most welcome, Rob, and thank you to all of you for taking the time.
All right, have a great day, everyone.